I am Aaron Doucette with AppGeo, and you're here for the presentation we put together on HxGN Content Plus, which is a brand new offering from Hexagon. And here at AppGeo, we have been working with Imagery for quite a while, and we're excited to dive into what this means for a lot of our statewide users. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a great team of panelists on the line, and I'm looking forward to a really cool presentation. Now, I want to walk through today's agenda very quickly. And in today's presentation, we're going to be looking at this problem in three different ways: the changing marketplace, what is going on in the world of imagery, and how is Hexagon and AppGeo a part of that? Then we're going to dive a little deeper into what is this Content Plus offering, and what does it mean differently than how you may have known to understand streaming imagery in the past. And then lastly, we've got a tech expert on the line with us today, Dave Breeding. He's going to dive a little deeper into some of the speed and scale advantages that come with streaming imagery and what AppGeo has done to address those concerns specifically. Some pretty cool stuff to come. I wanted to talk through a little bit about, AppGeo and Hexagon. They're two different companies. Why are we working together on this? Well, Hexagon and AppGeo have been partners. We are an authorized distributor for the content program ever since 2019. Now that seems really pretty recent, but in reality, we've gone pretty far in that time, worked with a handful of states throughout the country, and have really been a leading partner for the transition for a number of key states, Texas, Utah, California, in their statewide imagery programs. And additionally, we've worked closely with Hexagon when developing our Giza streaming appliance that you're going to hear about at the end. It's now being used with 7 statewide implementations. So, AppGeo is a company with a lot of strong beliefs and great people, and Hexagon's a company with a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge in this imagery space. So combined together, I think we're going to have some really cool insights for today. And to bring you those insights, we have today's presenters, starting first and foremost, Katie Fitzsimmons with Hexagon. She is great to work with, have known her my entire time here at AppGeo. And, she brings to the table 13 years of experience in this industry. She has expertise in all forms of geospatial data, imagery, and LiDAR systems. And is a real key player within this Hexagon imagery program in the customer relationships and also this business partner ecosystem. Now, also on the phone today with us, heavy hitter Bill Johnson, our Carpe Geo evangelist. He's been doing this stuff for 35 years, so you're not going to get anything past him. And that career culminated, he likes to say, as New York's State's first GIO. I like to say it's culminated with him here with us at AppGeo. And, during that time in New York, he saw the development from scratch of their imagery program now in its 20th year. So, he really has seen it all. And also David Breeding, Director of Analytics here at AppGeo. He is the total whiz when it comes to, actually getting this stuff to work properly. We can all talk about it all day, but when you want a solution that's actually going to perform and have the data to back it up, David is your guy. And lastly, myself, I'll be your host for today, Aaron Doucette. I've been around the block when it comes to imagery myself, but today I'm here to facilitate questions and keep the show on the road. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Katie to kick us off.
Yeah, and actually, Aaron, I think that Bill had a few words to get started as we begin.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Katie, and welcome, everyone. I took a look at the attendee list, and it's great to see a lot of familiar names on there. And speaking of familiar names, a lot of you may have known Randy Maiden from Hexagon. When I thought of Hexagon, that was who always came to mind was Randy. Saw him for many years at NISGIC, and I know he's been to a great many of the State GIS conferences, so probably a lot of you have spoken to him too. And Randy's just a great guy, kind of a classic middle American guy, very down to earth, very approachable. Well, Randy finally pulled the ripcord and retired in November. But luckily, Hexagon quickly filled his big shoes with Katie. So many of you may not know Katie yet, but hopefully that's going to change starting today. So welcome, Katie. It's great to have you with us. Before we get started with the tough questions, maybe let me just throw you a softball and ask you a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Sure, Bill. I'm happy to get started with that. I've actually worked with Randy for the last 5 years or so, but started my career in the mapping world with a LiDAR manufacturing company called Sigma Space. Our technology was known as single photon LiDAR, which some of you actually may be familiar with. And while there, I worked with both the engineering and the data teams, working really hard to achieve approval by the USGS and kind of move their spec from something that was just the traditional linear mode LiDAR sensor. So in 2016, our technology piqued the interest of Leica and they acquired Sigma Space. I was able to stay on with the hardware team for a few years and actually work with Randy on a couple of LiDAR projects during that time. And about 2 years ago or so, I switched over to the HxGN Content Program, where I have been working with our distribution partners and resellers since that time, and now kind of filling the role of business development, as you said, in Randy's shoes. Now, fortunately, Randy had so much experience, and thankfully, if he's not on the golf course, he'll still take our calls. So that's good news.
That's great. Thanks, Katie. I'm sure everybody's going to get to know you better going forward. I do have a suggestion for you. When we're able to travel again and go to in-person conferences, the hospitality suite is always a great place to get to know folks in a more casual setting. You probably already know that, but that's what I like to do. All right, so we've got a lot of ground to cover today. What I'm hoping to do is maybe, if you'll indulge me, I'll put on my former state GIO hat and ask you some questions, because I think I understand the state perspective and some of the questions that other states might have about these programs. So what we've been seeing here is these imagery licensed programs, content programs as we're calling them now. They've been around for a few years. And they've been evolving very quickly. And in fact, I've been surprised at just how quickly all this change is taking place. And it's turning out to be a fantastic time to be in this market, to be a buyer in this market. There's more options than ever, more competition than ever. Just the ball is moving quickly and the programs keep getting better. So let's just start with a little bit of history here. Can you point to anything that you can see in your tracking of the industry that really drove changes toward licensed imagery content as an alternative to the more traditional method, which is, put out an RFP for custom collection?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think probably if you asked around to colleagues in the industry, they may cite Google's decision several years ago to start licensing their imagery to states as kind of the first shift in the market. It's certainly true, but I think there's actually another and maybe less known catalyst that kind of started some of this. All of you are familiar with the USDA's NAEP program. It's been running for decades, right? Since the 1990s. But over that time, it's really evolved quite a bit. I mean, originally, the NAEP program was a traditional work for hire contract, but as the efficiencies of digital cameras, and I'll plug our Leica digital cameras there, the contracting model started to change as well. The big change came when the NAEP contract for imagery acquisition specifically stated that deliverables requested were the property of the NAEP program, but raw data that could be used to create derivative products and then resold to the market. So this was some really clever work by the USDA because it benefited the program in two ways. I mean, first of all, it brings down costs to NAEP because the program was spread over multiple sales, and NAEP has definitely realized this goal. And secondly, it allowed other data products like DSMs or stereos to be purchased at a later date when they were needed, or maybe just when budgets were available, which has also been realized. So over the years, Northwest Geomatics, who had been a prime contractor for years under NAEP, and probably some of you are familiar with, this is where our divisional president, John Welter, came from. They demonstrated to the USDA that under the program, they could concurrently collect a higher resolution imagery product, which could be resold into the market. And then this became a real game changer because the price point came down for NAEP. The data quality improved for NAEP, and it created an ecosystem in which acquisition partners, the USDA, and data consumers all benefited. So it's not super often you find a scenario that was actually win-win-win.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Katie. And I've been seeing this content stuff evolve, but I hadn't heard that NAEP backstory before. So that's really interesting. So USDA is able to get lower pricing from their contractors because the contractors, including Hexagon, were then able to go find additional buyers so that no single buyer is really paying the full cost of the imagery. So that's a great way to make sure that everybody gets a good deal. So we've seen these models now for a few years, and they've started to take hold in the States. Last time I checked, which is not terribly recently, there were at least 10 states that had made the switch to content programs. But I made a prediction at NISJIC a couple of years ago that it's not a matter of if states are going to switch from custom collect to these content programs, it's a matter of when. And I guess I'll give myself a teeny bit of credit for being at least partly right. But what we've seen is that the initial experience with content programs has maybe been too limiting for some states. Why haven't we got in several years more than 10 states involved? So let's see if we can unpack that a little bit. What are you hearing about what works and what doesn't work with these content programs? And what are the issues? What's holding back states from making that leap?
Sure. I mean, I think it's several things. First, most states who are running their own imagery programs right now want to continue to feel in control of their program, meaning data specifications, acquisition tempo, who can use their data. They want the best data to deliver to their stakeholders and to their constituents. And there's certainly some hesitation in moving to a licensed data product that decision makers will just lose some control. That's kind of why we've taken a deep look at how we've structured our content program and really open it up as much as possible to make it a lot more flexible. We're calling this program Content Plus, and really it allows the state to maintain all of their specifications, resolution, when they fly, but also, like the USDA's NAEP program, be able to put that data into our content program for resale. So in doing so, decision makers can maintain control of their program, but are also able to get a better price point because Hexagon can go resell it to our commercial customers.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying, Katie, is that when a state goes with this Content Plus program, what they're basically getting is the same specs that they would have put into their RFP for a custom collect. And so they're getting the same data, but at a lower price point because you're turning it into content for the program. And so with a small trade-off of accepting licensing as opposed to ownership of the data, that they can have it at a much lower price point. I think that's really a brilliant strategy to be able to honor those individual state specs as opposed to, kind of a standard vanilla spec, which is what you had in the past, right?
Correct.
Hexagon has created a real win-win here. And on some level, it sounds too good to be true. Like, what's the catch?
Yeah, I mean, what states are doing in these content programs, it's really the same thing a lot of people are doing in their personal lives, right? Like, we're no longer buying music in the form of a CD or individual songs, even on iTunes. We subscribe to music content services like Spotify. We get access to their entire catalog for a subscription fee. We don't own the music, but in $10 a month, we can listen to an unlimited amount of our favorite artists. And that music just happens to be owned by Spotify. So the same is happening in several areas with movies, a growing number of streaming services. And it's the model that really software companies have been using for a real long time. I mean, listen, even leasing your car is an example of it. We don't actually lease the car, but day to day, it feels very similar to ownership. So really the catch, as you refer to it, is just that the state gives up ownership of the data and is replacing that with a licensing agreement that details exactly how the state can use the data.
Okay, great. So let's talk about what that really means. So, I spent a lot of years working in the public sector, and there's some really deeply grained behaviors and expectations around how we deal with GIS data in the public sector. One of them is this concept of sharing the data widely, because the more people use it, the more value you get out of the data. And another is this general concept that if you're paying for data in the public sector, it needs to be released into the public domain, unless there's some specific, privacy or homeland security or whatever reason not to do that. So how do you respond to those two issues with a licensing model?
Sure. So let's start with the public domain question. This has come up actually quite a few times with other customers. And what we've been able to do is provide a downsampled version of the imagery that can be freely shared. So for example, a 15 centimeter data set resampled to a 30 centimeter public data set is perfectly acceptable under our use terms. This really just protects our ability to resell the higher resolution data and allows the state to meet the requirements around public access to imagery. So in a lot of cases, actually, the resampled data is a higher resolution than the state was publicly sharing previously, such as like the 60 centimeter NAPE imagery. And then the other issue you raised was widely sharing with a variety of users to get the most value out of the program. And I think actually our content program licensing works really well in this regard. The key for us is we want you to be able to use the data widely and across the government sector so that you ensure you get the full value out of it. Our licensing terms are actually quite generous in this regard. It already includes ability to share the data inside of the state and with state and local stakeholders inside of that particular state. But not only that, we also allow the data to be shared with third-party contractors who are performing work on behalf of those government agencies. I'd say probably the only restriction right now is that we don't allow sharing with federal agencies. And this is because they already have a set of their own national mandates. And we don't think it's very fair to subsidize them from our standard state license. So, and I want to point out that our license allows the imagery to be used in public-facing websites and applications as long as the data can't be downloaded. So when you kind of package all of these factors together, we think it's a pretty flexible and wide sharing ecosystems. And so far, a lot of our customers have agreed.
Yeah, and I'm aware that both Texas and Utah have been really pleased with how the licensing has met their needs. In fact, we had both Matt Peters and Richard Wade as guests on a webinar we did a few months ago talking about that and their insights on how they made the switch to content programs. Both of those states, by the way, are on their second rounds of imagery content, and we know that means a lot in terms of their satisfaction. Like nobody goes back to a restaurant where they had a bad meal, right?
I definitely do not go back to bad restaurants. But you actually brought something up and it made me think of something, and that is a topic we definitely need to cover, probably near and dear to your heart, Bill, which is contracting.
I was afraid you were going to bring that up. Yeah, that was actually my least favorite part of being a state GIO was contracting, especially RFPs. An RFP takes a long time. It involves, depending on a lot of people outside of the GIS shop, it's prone to delays. I just found it to be a painful process. So have you found a way to make it easier?
I think we're working on it, right? I think for decision makers now, the key is to build in some flexibility. If you're going to go through all that trouble you just described of putting out an RFP, add in some language for a content option. Really, there's nothing to lose. This way, you can let the vendors in the marketplace bid on both options, both the work for hire, the custom collect, and the content-based option, and the same specs, right? So then you'll get to see where your cost savings is, how much money you could actually save if you're running a content solution. But the best part is you're not necessarily making a commitment to either option. So there's really no reason not to include this at the moment. And actually, we're starting to see this come up more and more. Most recently, both the state of Michigan and the state of Minnesota included content options in their RFPs.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, Katie, really. And I agree with you. There's nothing to lose by putting that in there. It just gives you more flexibility and more options. And actually, as I think about this, I don't believe either Texas or Utah used an RFP for their latest round of imagery content, which raises another thing. It may be possible to acquire imagery content without going through a formal RFP. There may be, these things, RFPs are really a specific contracting vehicle for specific situation, and a content program is a lot more like a commodity purchase. And so, it's probably a good thing to go have a chat with your contracts people and see if there are other ways to do a deal for a content program that wouldn't require going through that lengthy RFP process. So that reminds me of something else here, and that is when we talk about RFPs, is just thinking about leaf off, which has always been a big deal, especially in kind of the eastern part of the country here. And one of the concerns we had issuing RFPs for leaf off is it's a very small collection window, and we were always concerned about contractors having enough capacity, enough aircraft, and enough cameras. I should say sensors. You don't call them cameras anymore, right? So I wonder if you could speak to the capacity issue, especially for states that want to option for a leaf off custom, or what do you call that? Content plus. Thank you.
Absolutely. And definitely you're right about the new sensors. I mean, I think your concern about capacity and how do I make sure I get a leaf off collect in a very tight time window. These are some of the needs that we're hearing even on our content user database. And those needs are the ones that flow back to our Leica R&D shop and really drive the R&D forward of our sensors, right? So we're looking for sensors that are more efficient in acquisition, can bring higher resolution data. And then, certainly you guys have already seen all of the hybrid sensors, those collecting both imagery and LiDAR concurrently. So most recently in our stack of sensor lineups is the ContentMapper. So the ContentMapper collects 2 times better resolution than our current ADS 100 sensors at the same flying altitude and with 2 times the swath width. So, the time we spend in the air is expensive. So when we can collect imagery with fewer line miles, as you know, this just saves money, right? So there's another advantage though to flying at those higher altitudes. This is just from an imagery processing and how the imagery looks at the end. There's less effect of tall buildings and less distortion in the imagery due to terrain effects. The images that you're seeing here now are actually some of the latest images from the ContentMapper taken over a small canton in Switzerland where all of the R&D is done for Leica. So, overall, we're excited about the ContentMapper because it really seems like a game changer in the amount of high resolution data we can push into our program. What's interesting though is acquisition isn't always the challenging part. We've got to be able to fly all that data with all of the sensors we have. We've got over, 5 of our own aircraft, but partners in our own ecosystem. We have over 20 aircraft that we have access to in any single flying season. This is how we're able to keep our library so up to date in North America and in Europe. And obviously in each of those aircraft, sensor is included. So once we've got all the data collected, certainly we have to process it and host it all. Just in 2020 alone, we were able to process over 600 terabytes of data, and we served out over 1 billion images on our streaming services. So, I think the key takeaway here is that our team is making big investments in infrastructure, whether that's sensors, aircraft, the partners who fly with us, and all the data processing resources for hosting and processing. And this is something that states can really take advantage of, right? Leveraging our resources allows you to focus less on acquisition and data deliveries and hosting, and more on just ensuring that you're meeting the needs of your stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks. That's really some impressive information here about those. I especially like what I'm seeing about that new ContentMapper sensor. And as we keep pushing to higher and higher resolution data, I mean, the volumes of data are just growing at an incredible rate here. I think it's easy to forget that when we talk about going from 30 centimeters to 15 centimeters, that's a 4 times the amount of data each step. And if we go from 30 to 7.5, that's 16 times more. And, when we store this stuff in an image pyramid, each layer in the pyramid is 4 times bigger than the layer below it. So the math gets really scary really fast.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, and I think luckily we're seeing a pretty big trend that folks are moving away from on-prem technology to handle that much data and really kind of pushing as much as they can to the cloud. Storage is certainly less expensive on the cloud than anything on-prem. And we're seeing a lot of movement towards streaming services. So this is something that allows data access for lots of users relatively quickly. And while we have a service here, I know that AppGeo actually has their really slick solution called Giza.
Yeah, thanks. And it actually took me a long time to figure out what the Giza name stood for. It's a play on the Great Pyramids of Egypt that are in Giza, and that's where the name comes from. I didn't know that for the first year I was with the company. So yeah, I'd love to tell you all about Giza, but it would be a really short conversation. So I'm going to bring in our AppGeo colleague David Breeding to give us that explanation. Hi, David. Can you start by telling us what Giza does and how we created it?
I'd be more than happy to do so. And some of those naming exercises can involve lots of outside thinkers. So, we like our name and but let me tell you a little bit about Giza for those that aren't familiar. We've been developing and honing this platform for the past 6 years. It started, when that Google Imagery program came out, getting this content from the cloud to end users, which is really the #1 mission. This imagery has to go from the cloud and be where people want to consume it via WMTS, via WMS, via well-structured kind of requests in the ways in which we expect it to be delivered. #2, we really needed to allow organizations, or we desired to give them the flexibility to provision this imagery in the ways that made the most sense, and also to respect kind of terms and any restrictions associated with that imagery. Similar to the Hexagon program, right? You want to make sure that those state entities have a certain level of access, and those public users also have the right level of access. So that zoom level granularity that you're exposing the data, Giza can control all of that. But finally, I think the unique value proposition of Giza is really how it can help facilitate a better understanding of how that imagery is being used across an organization. And today, I'm not going to get really deep into the technology and kind of configurations behind Giza, but really, I want to really touch on that just quickly. And what makes a successful kind of appliance is really getting that WMTS to be extremely performant. And we believe it's got to be able to deliver and respond, provide that response in like, or any, if it's going to respond any slower than a second, it's really just, it's not going to kind of provide that value that people need. That's the floor. You got to get it to the customer in at least a second. And that, any bigger delays than a second, you start to have this cognitive kind of wandering. Is the snow falling outside, or who's playing that music, right? You want people to be focused on their task, and you don't want them to be kind of waiting on things. But logically, then you ask, well, how fast does it need to be? And really how we classify and what we're shooting for is that 95% of those WMTS requests are getting to a user in like a half a second or less. And that consistency is what we're shooting for. And that's really the key in our minds. It's not necessarily being the fastest out there, but making sure that, regardless of the user demand, or regardless of that asset volume that you're trying to deliver, you're getting it to where it needs to be. But where I really want to focus today is just around how Giza can help decision makers understand that usage and make more informed decisions. Giza, when configured thoughtfully, when you think about who wants access to this, and kind of grouping people accordingly, it can lift that veil on usage patterns. It can kind of show for every vintage of imagery, for every registered user or group of users down to the tile, what's going on, where are they using it? What we got on the screen right now is showing this heat map capacity. And how you can zoom in and see the count of users actually going and engaging with this tile content. So, as a spatially focused team, this feature just made sense to us. We really wanted to have that ability to understand what's going on and kind of slice and dice the data and aggregate it at multiple different levels. In addition to this heat map kind of piece, we also can get at the tabular data, and group it and slice it and dice it to help make sense of it. By date is oftentimes another really compelling way that you want how is this kind of being done during the summer or the winter? What are the projects that are going on? How do I classify that influx of usership that's going on broadly, and just really giving the mechanisms to have access to this information to help answer questions. And if you want to create a complex query, we have SQL-based ways that you can engage with this massive volume of data. We're storing every tile for every user always while you're a customer.
I mean, David, that sounds really impressive and certainly a powerful resource. But I'm curious, with the installations that Giza has now, I'm wondering if you can share any examples of how your customers are actually using Giza for analytics.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we get there's lots of questions that people kind of are looking to answer, and we can classify them into 3 categories generally. Who is using one particular set of imagery? How much is that user using a particular set of imagery or multiple sets? And where is that usage occurring, or kind of the general buckets that all the questions fall into, or all the analytics that people are seeking to create. And really the most interesting to us is when those all intersect, the who, how much, and where kind of type questions. And as an example, I just really wanted to talk about recently, we were working with Georgia and trying to, at an intersection of all of those parameters. So we've been working with the state of Georgia for a number of years. They have Google Imagery, that's their primary layer. And since the Google Imagery program is no longer offering new buy-ups or new vintages, there was a question that came out, because they need to buy more imagery. They want to keep serving good content. And so they came to us, and they're kind of looking for some support and help. They had this feeling like, I think we really need leaf off imagery. Google has leaf off content. We would hate to kind of change, or impact those users that have gotten used to that. And so, we just can't consider certain things. What do you recommend? And we kind of well, are we sure that's the usage? Let's look at what your platforms, oftentimes we have to kind of show that this feature sometimes and see, how it can help. And really what do we do? So we looked at that historic usage of the Google imagery. You can see on the map right here, 2 levels of aggregation. We kind of found out where that high usage was. And we also looked at all the flight boundaries, because Google flew in these not as consistent blocks as Hexagon sometimes does, but long story short, they had the metadata about when the flight occurred. And so we could infer if there was a leaf on or leafed off period, and being a deciduous part of the country, that, that we kind of had that information. Long story short, we were able to kind of show, to kind of tip on the head, that, well, we feel like 70% of our users are using leaf off, but in reality, 60% of the users are actually using leaf on imagery, and it's oftentimes in the most dense parts of the state. So, really that data just allowed them to be comfortable with it. Like, oh, that's how it's being used, and opening them to other options. And so it was an orienting kind of moment. Pretty easy to do once you just kind of take a look at it. And so that's an example of kind of a really good use case for how this data can be helpful.
Yeah, I think the cool part about that is that just by, looking through all of the analytics and asking some of the questions, it gives the decision makers a lot more confidence in how to move forward. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing we hear sometimes, is that, decision makers have suspicion on how they think their users are using the data, what applications are using, who's using the most data, this type of thing, but they don't actually know with any kind of granular analytic who's using it, how much they're using, what they're using it for. So, I think that here's another way where Giza can really help give a lot more insight, right?
Yeah, no, we were excited to see that kind of use case, and that's not all. There's lots of other ways that this analytics kind of comes out, and I'd be happy to go into another kind of story at this point. When we think about other clients that are using analytics, the state of Texas is another big user of ours, and they they have a question. They really want to understand who is using and how much they're using it, to kind of get at a question of theirs for how do we potentially find a fair way to allocate their usage to these end users, kind of sharing this, having a fair kind of funding model to kind of help grow and expand their imagery program. And really that's pretty straightforward for Giza. We can go and, by whether it's a tag or a group, and pull out exactly how a department is using the imagery, where they're using the imagery, and ultimately drive buy-ups, which is kind of where they are right now. They knew which areas of the country were using more imagery, and that just helped them make a good decision about how to invest and who might be able to help support that investment.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, Giza really paints a nice picture for leaders who want to see how their data is being used. So I have another question for you, though. Sometimes we see folks who are, they're managing a lot of data, like multiple vintages of imagery, and they're worried about moving to a licensed data product because they fear it will be really challenging to integrate the new data. And they've already made loads of investment in all of this historical data, and they don't want to lose that. So does Giza help with this problem also?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Giza can help, in short. At a very kind of high level, it starts with raw imagery, right? I have this old imagery resource, and we, AppGeo as a service company, or we have a products wing and a services wing, we can do the tiling. We can get that imagery prepared. We have lots of tools that help bring that data right into that ready form in cloud storage to be delivered. Also, many customers have existing tile caches, right? They've generated the tiles. They're on a server somewhere. Maybe that server isn't performing the way that they would hope. It's not getting it to the customer or the end user in a second or less. And there's ways to kind of lift those resources if they're well structured, and kind of make sure they can be leveraged by Giza. Again, with a little bit of services, we can lift and drop, do some migrations into the cloud. But one of the most simplest integrations is kind of to get access to that analytics, to get access to the user control components of things. You can just take your existing WMTS endpoint, plug it into Giza, and start tracking, as long as they're using the Giza endpoint, what's happening, who's using what, and it's just handing the tiles through and just managing and collecting how that's being used. So I think there's some caveats here with what's possible, and I can happy to answer more questions, but any well-structured WMTS or well-structured tile resource that's in AWS, GCP, or Azure, we can kind of consume that data and start gathering analytics and provisioning access to it.
Yeah, David, I mean, thank you for that high level. I know that you could probably talk for hours on all of the intricacies of Giza, but in the, trying to think about time and getting folks, getting to those Q&As, I want to just wrap some things up here. So, from a Content Plus perspective, I think there's probably 4 key takeaways. The first one is that you can maintain your current specs or even improve them, right? You want to do buy-ups of higher resolution in the cities. This is certainly possible under the Content Plus program. The second thing is usership. We know and we recognize this is important. So we built licensing that's flexible to ensure that you can continue to extend licensing to your current users without any gaps at all. And, of course, I would be crazy not to mention costs, and just not hard costs like the actual purchase price of the Content Plus program. But there's all of these other soft costs that Bill and I kind of alluded to early on: contracting, RFP management, acquisition management, and then just managing all of that data all add up. And in a licensed model, we carry the burden of all of those costs. That way you can focus on just delivering to your stakeholders. And that's really the bottom line, right? All of your energy can be focused going forward on just making sure that your stakeholders, your constituents have the best imagery services to make sure that they can deliver to their internal customers as well. And again, this, I think, just gives you a couple of other key takeaways on all of the flexible options in terms of leaf off, image resolution, acquisition tempo, and as we mentioned on the buy-up side. So hopefully at this point, we've been fairly clear that the program is built with flexibility in mind, and knowing that state by state, we're not all operating on the same acquisition specifications. So in order to help address that a little bit better, we've offered all of these knobs to turn such that you can build a program that'll work for you.
Thanks, Katie. I actually have a question or two for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you've talked quite a bit about the licensing terms. Is there any flexibility? I mean, if a state had some particular requirement, would you entertain flexing at all in your terms in the license?
Absolutely, right? I mean, I think that particularly on a statewide implementation, we know that the decision makers have accountability to those they serve. So, if there's something that there's some kind of licensing term that has been historically in place, we'd welcome an opportunity to talk about it and see how we could accommodate that particular request.
Okay, great. My other question is the leaf off, which I think is going to be of high interest. I know it's a very challenging thing. The flight window in the spring is very narrow and tough to do over large areas. Do you have states already collected in leaf off, or is this a forward-looking option?
So we have done leaf off states in the past. As most of you know, our program has been very tightly aligned to NAEP. So traditionally, we haven't really done leaf on work. With that said, I definitely think about the capacity that we mentioned. The leaf off window in the Northeast is very short, but it also typically starts before the NAEP acquisition begins. And so we have the flexibility to kind of expand or contract our fleet fairly quickly. So if we needed to mobilize, 7 or 8 aircraft to an area to make sure we could get that imagery in a certain time window, we can definitely do that. The other thing too is that some of these states, Bill, because the flight window is so short, aren't even collecting statewide year over year, right? They're chopping it up into, thirds or fifths or something like that. And we're happy to follow that model as well. If that's the way that you're used to consuming the imagery and you only need a third of the state flown over the next 3 years, a third, we're happy to follow that model as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually how we did things in New York while I was there too.
I recall.
I don't know. Is Aaron back to join us now? If not, I guess
I am here.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
I think we're ready to move to the Q&A session, Aaron.
Great. And before we hop into that Q&A, if you liked what you heard about Giza, we're planning on going a little bit more in depth on March 3rd with a full hour Giza webinar. So if you have specific Giza questions, we can go into them in a lot more detail there, as well as show you some really cool use cases where states have actually been able to save money with Giza. So do look forward to that, and we'll be sending out invitations very soon. Just wanted to make sure everyone on this call was aware. And with that, I'd like to launch into Q&A. We already have several questions in, but I want to encourage our audience to keep asking, as we've got our panelists here to help out with those questions. I'll throw out a pitch. As a budding photographer myself, Katie, if you want to send one of those Leica cameras for me to test out, I'm more than happy. But to launch into our Q&A here, we do have a few questions, and forgive me, they're on my upper screen if you see me looking up there. So Dennis asks, if a state has a leaf off requirement, does Content Plus ensure this too? Just depending on specifics of that state. So I know you guys talked about it a little bit, but just can you shore up the leaf off or leaf on question for Dennis?
Yeah, for sure. So the genesis of Content Plus really is driven by leaf off, because so many states are accustomed to seeing a leaf off product. And so this is really why we've made this pivot, is to commit to delivering to your specification. So if your specification is a 30 centimeter statewide leaf off delivery, that's what you'll get under the Content Plus program. And then that's what we'll be happy to resell to other customers in the commercial space.
Awesome. And it does sound like Dennis thought the answer was good. And let's see, he's curious about the eastern states that have Content Plus now, whether some of them are doing leaf off.
Yeah, so Bill alluded to this a bit, and the Content Plus program is new for 2021. So this is a forward-looking program. While we do have several states who are customers under the traditional content program, meaning that they buy the data that's off the shelf, this program is new and really tailored to those states who are driving their own RFPs and have requirements like leaf off or like higher resolution.
Cool. Thank you very much. Now, here's a question coming from Joe, a couple questions. It sounds like he likes Giza. So Joe, do come to our Giza webinar and we'll be able to talk a bit more there. But he's curious if this will allow connections to Esri and Autodesk cloud solutions, the plug and play compatibility aspect for Giza.
Yeah, no, just quickly, the endpoints that Giza provide are WMTS and WMS. So, we've seen from a CAD perspective, AutoCAD kind of consuming WMS services. Those are the two mechanisms that we, really provide to kind of tie in. We are looking at other platforms, always just trying to hear what people want to bring in and what those requirements are. But today, those are the endpoints that are available. But we're kind of would love to hear more about your use case and platforms and how they'd like to consume imagery.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. Here's another very interesting question and one that I've heard in the past as well. What are the requirements for some of these emergency management users who, might, off-site connectivity could be an issue, or having their own copies of the data? Do you have any solutions for those type of users?
Yeah, and actually I'm glad that Jim asked this question because we didn't address it in the slide deck, but typically when we deliver for any statewide customer, in addition to getting the streaming services, they also get hard copy deliverables. So we'll ship them as many drives as they need in order to deliver all of the data in their state. So then that particular customer can, host in like a DR site if they need something for emergency management or something like that. So this is kind of regular protocol to deliver on hard copy. And certainly we understand for things like emergency management, needing to have that native copy locally is certainly important, and we could easily accommodate that request.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Especially, I know in the PSAP community, there can be challenges when it comes to having everybody, wired up to internet sources, and data security is definitely a concern there. We do have time for more questions. I see some more coming in. Someone has asked, is the standard resolution 15 cm? Where is that resolution being offered relative to the previous program and then this Content Plus program?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, I think from like the Hexagon Content Program itself, really you can think of, the off-the-shelf delivery, which is typically going to be a leaf-on product. Right now we have a nationwide fabric of 30 centimeters with 15 centimeters throughout the metros. In 2020, Texas was flown entirely at 15 centimeters. So now you have a full statewide at 15. In 2021, we have about 6 more states planned to be flown at that 15 centimeter resolution. So I think over the next 3 to 4 years, one of the big drivers is just better resolution data. So you'll see the entire US come in at 15 centimeters. The Content Plus program is different in that, if you needed something temporally special, leaf on, leaf off, you wanted buy-ups, you wanted 15 centimeter statewide, or you wanted 7.5 centimeter for all of your metros. Basically, think about how you're speccing out your RFP for your current statewide and then plug that into a licensed model. That's Content Plus. Whereas the existing content data, that's what we've got off the shelf. Leaf on, either 15 or 30 centimeter, still excellent data, but just maybe slightly amiss from the specification that your state may have.
Excellent. And we have another question coming in. I was curious about this as well. So Eric is asking how this could apply for county governments. He likes the idea of including a content option in their next RFP. Could you maybe talk about, we've talked about Content Plus a lot, maybe a little bit who this program is specifically tailored in mind for and who is going to qualify?
Sure. It's a good question. I think from a top level, states are our first favorite customer because it aligns very closely to how we fly today, meaning we fly entire states in a flying season. We don't kind of parcel things out. But other targets would certainly be like COGS, large metro areas. I think we want to be keeping to kind of larger areas in general, but I don't want to preclude folks from not reaching out if they have a county that maybe could benefit from Content Plus. Certainly get in touch with the folks at AppGeo and see how we can move you guys forward, because I think that there can certainly be some flexibility there.
Yeah, especially if you and enough other counties get together, then that makes a
Exactly.
pretty strong case for
Exactly.
the state leadership there and making your needs known.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We do have a few more minutes for questions. I don't see any coming in at the moment, but if someone wants to get a couple more in, now would be the chance. Do we have any more comments from Bill, Katie, or David?
I actually had a question, Katie, just about, from an area perspective. Obviously, states are what we're looking for. If you are going to try to get a cooperative group together, is there some area measure that would kind of qualify for content program? Do you think about it that way, or is everyone kind of, open for evaluation? Just kind of curious for us.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, for example, the square miles that I might toss out there for counties in the western part of the US may be really large. And that's simply because there's so much expanse out there. Whereas a smaller area like the New York City or Philadelphia or Boston Metro, I should be saying, AppGeo friends, is quite a valuable data set, but maybe from a square miles perspective, a little bit smaller. So there's a couple of factors that we use when kind of considering how does this data work in our program. I think Aaron's point earlier that if counties can kind of partner up together and buy a big block of data, that's probably going to be the most cost-effective way to make a Content Plus program happen. And I'll mention too, right, for those of you who can accept the leaf-off data, even in counties, we can certainly work with the AppGeo team to take a look at the vintage of the data that's in the program right now and see if any of that could possibly work for you.
Awesome. So we do have one last question. Nick is asking if there are demos available. So I know from the AppGeo side, we can provision a demo of the Giza product, if that's something you're interested in giving a test drive. Mm-hmm. And Katie, I know we give demos to the HxGN Content Program all the time to show what a firsthand user of that will have. But if you want to add anything about demo access or how to push the ball forward with.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, the quickest and easiest way is to just sign up for the free streaming trial. And again, any of the folks on the AppGeo call can help you here with that, or you can just do that on our website. It's a 10-day free streaming trial that will give you a really good look and taste to see if the data works for you. Yeah. Secondly, if you're looking for hard pixels, you want to kind of work it through your workflow and something more traditional, we can absolutely get you some sample imagery of data that we have that's off the shelf now. Now, I'm really excited because we're working on putting together kind of our for public release ContentMapper data samples, and these should be out soon, and I'm sure you'll see some press on some of this. So I've been pushing to make sure we get US data instead of all of our beautiful Swiss data that we continue to fly. So that's what you should see probably in the next couple of weeks.
Great. Yep. And make sure you put AppGeo in that partner box when you sign up for your demo. And that way one of us will be the ones helping you out. All right. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters. This was really informative, and really thank our audience for sticking in there and asking some really great questions. We'll be putting out a recording of today's session to all of you in case you want to review it, share it with colleagues, or for those of you who might have missed it. And any parting words from the panelists before we sign off today?
Yeah, let me just pipe in. I think a few years ago, these content programs, these licensing models might have looked a bit risky. They've really shifted into the mainstream. I think the tipping point is right around the corner, where this will be the model that nearly everyone uses for many of their use cases for imagery. And I think what's going to happen is that the more traditional model of issuing an RFP for a custom collect is going to become something for special requirements that maybe aren't appropriate on a statewide scale, or to meet some particular requirements that really aren't what your broad user base needs. So I'm really excited. I think this Content Plus offering is a really smart offering from Hexagon in being able to accommodate the very same specs that states are already using. So I really think this is going to result in a lot of movement to this model.
Thanks, Bill.
I just want to chime in too and just say, we've been working with Hexagon from a technical perspective, just kind of collaborating with their team, and they've been really great and create all these opportunities for new ways to collaborate. So, it's really kind of opening our mind and how we think about, how does imagery get streamed in the future, right? You're streaming WMTS today, but what about these assets and how you might be able to provision machine learning pipelines, or so the ways in which they're structuring their content using cloud optimized geotips file structures, and just really the ways that their technical team is kind of considering these pipes. And so there's just a lot of good stuff that's going to come down the road, so to speak. And we're just glad to be kind of partners with Hexagon and hopefully pushing out some new interesting features, and expanding the analytics on the Giza side of things. So look for more, and we can talk more about it during the upcoming webinar.
Awesome. Well, you heard it here first, folks, from Bill Johnson himself and David Breeding. This definitely sounds like a wave that you want to be riding. So get in touch, and we look forward to talking to you all in our next presentation.